Fade in, exterior South Atlantic Ocean, establishing, begin titles, end titles. The salvage ship the Minotaur is in the area. Cut to, interior bridge, day. Hal Harris, captain of the ship the Minotaur, and owner of the Happy Harris Deep Sea Salvage Team Company, is on the bridge. Hal Harris says,
"Today is a great day."
Hal sits in the captain's chair. He sees Clint George, the navigator. Clint George says,
"Sir, where are we headed to?"
Hal Harris says,
"I'm glad you asked. I have gotten news about a huge haul in the nearby region."
Clint George says,
"Nearby region."
Hal Harris says,
"Yeah, our employer had mentioned that there's a large deep-sea lab in the middle of the South Atlantic."
Clint George says,
"Is that so?"
Hal Harris says,
"Yeah, although I doubt it actually exists."
Clint George says,
"You're not sure that it exists."
Hal Harris says,
"It's just rumors at the moment."
Clint George says,
"I just hope you're right about the matter."
Butch Ferguson, the right-hand man of Hal Harris, enters the bridge. Hal Harris says,
"So, you have arrived."
Butch Ferguson says,
"Yeah, I'm here."
Clint George says,
"I'm surprised that you even made it here."
Butch Ferguson says,
"You're just lucky you're the new guy on this crew."
Clint George says,
"What do you mean?"
Hal Harris says,
"Now hold on a minute."
Butch Ferguson says,
"I have way more experience than you.
Hal Harris says,
Ahem.
Butch Ferguson says,
Besides you, of course."
Hal Harris says,
Now that that's settled, let's get down to business.
Butch Ferguson says,
"Of course."
Clint George says,
"Of course."
Hal gets on the intercom. Hal Harris says,
How's everything on your end, Herman?
Interior engineering room, day. Herman Richards, the chief engineer, presses the button on the intercom. Herman Richards says,
Everything's all right on this end.
Interior bridge, day. Hal Harris is on the bridge. Hal Harris says,
That's good to hear.
Interior engineering room, day. Herman presses the button on the intercom. Herman Richards says,
Do you want me to put the engine into overdrive?
Interior bridge, day. Hal gets the transmission. Hal Harris says,
That won't be necessary.
Herman Richards says,
Understood.
Hal ends the communications. Clint George says,
That was certainly interesting.
Butch Ferguson says,
"Yeah."
Hal Harris says,
What's the status?
Clint George says,
We're on course as we speak.
Hal Harris says,
That's good to hear.
Butch Ferguson says,
"How much longer is it?"
Clint George says,
It's 14 nautical miles and closing.
Butch Ferguson says,
"That's good to hear."
Hal Harris says,
Yeah, we're going to be rich.
Butch Ferguson says,
"Is money all you care about?"
Hal Harris says,
Not at all.
Butch Ferguson says,
"Why am I not surprised?"
Hal Harris says,
It's all about the journey.
Clint George says,
I get it now.
Hal Harris says,
Exactly.
Clint George says,
I'm starting to get something on screen as we speak.
Hal Harris says,
That must be the place.
Clint George says,
What's the place called anyway?
Hal Harris says,
Our employer said that the place is called the Advanced Test Center for Genetic Mutations.
Clint George says,
That can't be good.
Hal Harris says,
Yes, the employer mentioned that there were some sort of experiments performed at the place.
Clint George says,
What kinds of experiments?
Hal Harris says,
He mentioned that the scientists were trying to create some sort of mutant.
Clint George says,
That can't possibly be good.
Hal Harris says,
Yes,
Clint George says,
Did the employer say why they abandoned the place?
Hal Harris says,
unfortunately, he didn't say the reason why, although he did suspect that it had to do with one of their experiments.
Clint George says,
Experiments.
Hal Harris says,
Yes,
Clint George says,
I don't like the sounds of the place.
Hal Harris says,
you're not the only one who's worried.
Butch Ferguson says,
"Oh great, here we go again."
Hal Harris says,
Do you mind?
Butch Ferguson says,
"As you wish."
Clint George says,
I'm surprised that you would be worried as well.
Hal Harris says,
Of course, but I'm sure that things will work out for the best.
Clint George says,
I get it now.
Hal Harris says,
I'm sure you will get it.
Butch Ferguson says,
"I can't believe this."
Hal Harris says,
Now's not the time for that.
Butch Ferguson says,
"If you insist."
Hal sees the lab in the distance. Hal Harris says,
There it is, boys.
Clint George says,
That's the lab.
Hal Harris says,
Yes, that's the lab.
Butch Ferguson says,
"I'll go tell the guys."
Butch leaves the bridge. Hal Harris says,
That was certainly interesting.
Clint George says,
Of course, sir.
Hal Harris says,
We're about to arrive at the lab.
Clint George says,
Shall I stop the ship?
Hal Harris says,
Not just yet.
Clint George says,
What do we do now?
Hal Harris says,
We move into range of the lab.
Clint George says,
What do we do next?
Hal Harris says,
Butch shall lead a team into the place. They shall survey the find.
Clint George says.
Understood, sir.
Hal gets on the intercom. He contacts Butch. Cut to interior crew quarters. Day. Butch Ferguson is in the quarters. He gets the call over the intercom. Butch Ferguson says.
Understood, sir.
Butch ends the transmission. He turns to Shane Davidson, Leland Gonzalez, Cornelius Pittman, Homer Graves, and Terrence Copeland. Butch Ferguson says.
All right, boys, you heard the captain.
Shane Davidson says.
Yeah.
Leland Gonzalez says.
Of course.
Cornelius Pittman says.
We're going to be heading into the lab very soon.
Homer Graves says.
Yeah, we've better get the mini boat ready.
Terrence Copeland says.
Obviously, that's a good idea.
Shane Davidson says.
Did he say what the place was called?
Butch Ferguson says.
Yeah. The place is called the Advanced Test Center for Genetic Mutations.
Leland Gonzalez says.
That can't be good.
Homer Graves says.
Yeah.
Terrence Copeland says.
We're going to get a huge haul.
Shane Davidson says.
Of course.
Butch Ferguson says.
In that case, let's get set up.
Butch and the team start readying for the away team. Cut to interior bridge. Day. Hal and Clint are on the bridge. Clint George says.
We're now in range of the lab.
Hal Harris says.
Now we can stop the ship.
Clint George says.
Aye, Captain.
Clint proceeds to stop the ship. Clint George says.
What do we do now?
Hal Harris says.
We wait. Butch and the team shall start the mission shortly.
Clint George says.
Understood, sir.
Butch contacts Hal via radio. Butch Ferguson says.
Hal, are you there?
Hal gets on the radio communicator. Hal Harris says.
I hear you loud and clear.
Butch Ferguson says.
The team is now ready to head into the lab.
Hal Harris says.
All right, you're ready to go.
Cut to interior miniboat. Day. Butch Ferguson is at the helm of the miniboat. He ends the communications. Butch Ferguson says.
All right, boys. Let's get this mission underway.
Butch signals to the crew member operating the loading bay. The crew member opens the hatch. The loading bay fills with water. Butch and the away team exit the salvage ship. Cut to 10. Interior bridge. Day. Hal and Clint are on the bridge. Don Delgado, the communications officer, arrives on the bridge. Hal sees him. Hal Harris says.
I'm sure you know what kind of day today is.
Don Delgado says.
Of course, sir.
Hal Harris says.
Are you ready for this?
Don Delgado says.
Of course, sir.
Don goes over to the communications post. Don Delgado says.
We're all ready to go, sir.
Hal Harris says.
That's good to hear.
Don gets a call over the radio. Butch Ferguson says.
We are on our way to the lab as we speak.
Don Delgado says.
We hear you loud and clear.
Butch Ferguson says.
We should be entering the dock very soon.
Don Delgado says.
We hear you.
Hal Harris says.
Yeah, we see the ship.
Butch Ferguson says.
I just wanted to let you know that.
11. Clint George says.
Hey, Captain.
Hal Harris says.
What is it?
Clint George says.
I just noticed something.
Hal Harris says.
What are you talking about?
Clint George says.
The place seems to be derelict.
Hal Harris says.
Yeah, the place was abandoned several years ago.
Clint George says.
Why was it abandoned?
Hal Harris says.
I have suspected that there was some sort of experiments performed at the place. The experiment went out of control.
Clint George says.
That can't be good.
Hal Harris says.
Yeah, of course, it's only a rumor.
Clint George says.
Hopefully it should stay that way.
Hal Harris says.
Of course.
Clint George says.
Captain Harris.
Hal Harris says.
What is it?
Clint George says.
Where did you hear that rumor?
Hal Harris says.
That was years ago.
12. Clint George says.
Hopefully it will remain a rumor.
Hal Harris says.
Of course.
Cut to exterior dock. Day. Butch and the team arrive at the dock. Butch Ferguson says.
All right, boys, let's get this mission underway.
Butch maneuvers the mini-boat closer to the dock. Terrence goes topside. Butch Ferguson says.
Are you ready, Terrence?
Terrence Copeland says.
Of course.
Terrence tosses the rope. He wraps it around the bollard. Terrence moors the mini-boat. Terrence Copeland says.
It's tied, Butch.
Butch Ferguson says.
All right, boys, let's do this.
Butch and the team disembark from the mini-boat. Butch Ferguson says.
Which one of you has the radio?
Homer Graves says.
I have it, sir.
Butch Ferguson says.
Good. I was just checking.
Homer Graves says.
Understood, sir.
The team head into the lab. Homer gets on the radio. 13. Homer Graves says.
This is Homer Graves.
Don Delgado says.
We hear you.
Homer Graves says.
We are headed into the lab.
Don Delgado says.
Good luck with the mission.
Homer Graves says.
Understood.
Homer ends the transmission. Cut to interior bridge. Day. Hal, Clint, and Don are on the bridge. Hal Harris says.
What's the situation?
Don Delgado says.
The team had made it onto the dock. They're heading into the lab as we speak.
Hal Harris says.
That's good to hear.
Clint George says.
What do we do now?
Hal Harris says.
We wait for Butch and the team to complete the mission.
Clint George says.
Understood, sir.
Cut to 14. Interior Advanced Test Center. Day. Butch and the team had entered the lab. Butch Ferguson says.
All right, boys, keep your radios ready.
Homer Graves says.
Understood, sir.
Butch Ferguson says.
Let's spread out.
Butch and the team proceed to spread out. Cut to interior bridge. Day. Hal, Clint, and Don are on the bridge. Don Delgado says.
What do we do now?
Hal Harris says.
We wait until Butch and the team complete the mission. In the meantime, you are to keep an eye on the radio.
Don Delgado says.
Understood, sir.
Clint George says.
Hey, Captain Harris.
Hal Harris says.
What is it?
Clint George says.
I thought that Butch and the team would have video cameras so that they can record the events.
Hal Harris says.
They do.
Clint George says.
I get it now.
15. Hal Harris says.
Yes. I thought that it would be a good idea to make an archival video of our expeditions.
Don Delgado says.
Captain Harris.
Hal Harris says.
What is it?
Don Delgado says.
I had heard something about there being a mutant housed in the lab.
Hal Harris says.
Oh, that's just a rumor.
Don Delgado says.
Are you sure about that?
Hal Harris says.
Yes, I heard about that a while back.
Don Delgado says.
Understood.
Cut to Interior Advanced Test Center. Day. Homer Graves and Shane Davidson are in a segment of the lab. Homer Graves says.
What do you think we'll find here at the lab?
Shane Davidson says.
I'm not sure. I did hear from Captain Harris that there was some sort of experiments performed at this place.
Homer Graves says.
Experiments. What kinds of experiments?
Shane Davidson says.
It was some sort of experiments in genetic engineering.
16. Homer Graves says.
Genetic engineering. That can't be good.
Interior Video Archive Room. Day. Homer and Shane enter the room. Shane Davidson says.
Where on earth are we?
Homer Graves says.
From the looks of it, we're in the video archive room.
The pair look around the place. Shane Davidson says.
I'm starting to see the vertical bar point.
Homer Graves says.
From the looks of it, there's a large amount of video recordings.
Shane Davidson says.
Yeah.
Homer Graves says.
They must have made recordings of all of the experiments they made.
Shane Davidson says.
Yeah. From the looks of it, they must have done a lot of experiments.
Homer goes over to the VCR. Homer Graves says.
Hey Shane.
Shane Davidson says.
What is it?
Homer Graves says.
There's a VCR over here.
Shane Davidson says.
Well, that would be one way of playing back the videos stored here.
17. Homer Graves says.
Yeah. I thought that the videos would be stored on a digital video recorder.
Shane Davidson says.
Well, the place has been around for quite some time.
Shane sees a digital video recorder. Shane Davidson says.
Hey Homer, I found something.
Homer Graves says.
What is it?
Shane Davidson says.
It looks like a digital video recorder.
Homer Graves says.
Now that's what I'm talking about.
Shane Davidson says.
Yeah. They must have done some upgrades in recent years.
Homer Graves says.
Let's check out some of the videos.
Shane Davidson says.
That sounds like a good idea. How tough we should at least inform Butch and the others about this.
Homer Graves says.
Good point.
Homer radios Butch. Shane Davidson says.
What's the situation?
Homer Graves says.
Butch is on his way.
Shane Davidson says.
That's good to hear.
18. Interior Video Archive Room. Day. Later, Butch enters the video archive room. Butch Ferguson says.
All right, boys. What's this I hear about a video archive room?
Homer Graves says.
We recently came across this room during the exploration.
Shane Davidson says.
Yeah. We found all sorts of videos.
Homer Graves says.
Not only that, but we also found a digital video recorder.
Butch Ferguson says.
So, it seems that there is an entire collection of recordings in this room.
Homer Graves says.
Yeah.
Butch Ferguson says.
Did either of you play any of the tapes yet?
Shane Davidson says.
No, we only got here moments ago.
Homer Graves says.
Yeah, we figured you would want to know about our find.
Butch Ferguson says.
All right, that's understandable. Let's check it out.
Homer Graves says.
All right.
Butch approaches one of the shelves. He picks up one of the videotapes. Butch Ferguson says.
It seems it's just recordings of experiments.
19. Butch notices one of the DVDs. Butch Ferguson says.
This is interesting.
Homer Graves says.
What is it?
Butch Ferguson says.
There's a DVD over here.
Homer Graves says.
Well, what are we waiting for? Put it in the player.
Butch Ferguson says.
Of course. That was what I was about to do.
Butch places the DVD in the DVD player. Angle on. Television screen. Byron Perry is on screen. Byron Perry says.
Log entry number 772. This is Dr. Byron Perry reporting. The genetic experiment is going along excellently.
In walks Edward Porter, one of the scientists. Byron turns to Edward. Byron Perry says.
What is its status on the subject?
Edward Porter says.
It's advancing at a rather fast pace.
Byron Perry says.
Fast pace.
Edward Porter says.
Yes. I'm actually surprised that we were able to splice together human DNA and piranha DNA.
Back to scene 20. Homer Graves says.
That can't be good.
Shane Davidson says.
Yeah. A humanoid piranha lurking around the area.
Butch Ferguson says.
Do you guys mind?
Homer Graves says.
Sorry.
Shane Davidson says.
Sorry.
Butch Ferguson says.
Well, it's time to get back to business.
Angle on. Television screen. Byron Perry is on screen. Byron Perry says.
Log entry number 774. This is Dr. Byron Perry reporting. The genetic experiment is now fully grown. The test subject is now exhibiting signs of enhanced agility and strength.
A banging noise could be heard. SFX, bang. Byron Perry says.
Oh God.
Elliot Garrett, a scientist, comes rushing into the room. Elliot Garrett says.
Byron, we have a situation on our hands.
Byron Perry says.
What are you talking about?
21. Elliot Garrett says.
The test subject has escaped from its containment unit.
Byron Perry says.
This is serious. Is the security team there?
Elliot Garrett says.
Yes. Tanner and his team are on their way to the spot as we speak.
Byron Perry says.
That's good.
Byron grabs a digital camera. Byron Perry says.
We'll record this one.
Elliot Garrett says.
You do realize that the area is locked down.
Byron Perry says.
Oh right.
Byron places the digital camera back on the desk. Byron Perry says.
Hey Elliot.
Elliot Garrett says.
What is it?
Byron Perry says.
Did you ever think about how we're meddling in things we really shouldn't be doing?
Elliot Garrett says.
Not really. Why did you ask?
Byron Perry says.
We are creating genetic mutations after all.
Elliot Garrett says.
Some people may think it's a sin against nature, but I think we're paving a way to the future.
22. Byron Perry says.
I begin to see your point.
The DVD recording ends. Back to scene. Butch Ferguson says.
This is just great.
Homer Graves says.
Yeah, things were getting good.
Shane Davidson says.
Yeah. Now we know that there is a mutant.
Butch Ferguson says.
Of course. Let's check out some more videos.
Butch checks out some more DVDs. He finds another DVD. Butch Ferguson says.
This is rather interesting.
Homer Graves says.
What is it?
Shane Davidson says.
You found another one.
Butch Ferguson says.
Yes.
Homer Graves says.
What's on the DVD?
Butch Ferguson says.
It doesn't say.
Homer Graves says.
What the hell are you talking about?
Butch Ferguson says.
See for yourself.
Butch shows Homer the DVD. 23. Homer Graves says.
I begin to see what you're talking about.
Shane Davidson says.
Yeah. Hopefully there will be something good on this one.
Butch Ferguson says.
Yeah.
Butch places the DVD in the player. It starts up. Angle on. Television screen. The containment unit room is on screen. The mutant is in one of the tubes. It is punching the tube, trying to get out. A crack in the tube forms. Tanner Daniel and the security team show up. Tanner Daniel says.
All right, boys. Let's get the thing under control.
The tube shatters. The mutant escapes from the tube. Mutant says.
Raph.
Scientist number 1 says.
Thank God you guys showed up.
Tanner Daniel says.
Of course.
Scientist number 2 says.
I'm surprised the tube didn't hold out longer.
The mutant lunges at scientist number 2. Scientist number 2 dies from his wounds. Scientist number 1 says.
Oh my God.
Tanner Daniel says.
Don't worry. We have this under control.
24. Mutant says.
Raph.
The mutant lunges at Tanner. The security team surround the mutant. The mutant slashes at the group. The mutant manages to kill several of the members of the team. The mutant knocks Tanner back. The mutant kills scientist number 1. Tanner attempts to grab the mutant. The mutant slashes at him. The mutant scars Tanner's left eye in the process. Tanner Daniel says.
Oh, damn it.
Tanner stumbles backwards. The mutant runs towards the door. The mutant manages to escape the room. Tanner manages to find a piece of cloth. He uses it to stop the bleeding. Tanner Daniel says,
Now then, where the hell did he go?
Tanner leaves the room. Back to scene. Homer Graves says,
This is great.
Shane Davidson says,
Yeah. The mutant is out there somewhere.
Homer Graves says,
Yeah, Tanner is still alive, isn't he?
Butch Ferguson says,
From the looks of it, he might have not survived the battle.
Shane Davidson says,
Yeah. Then again, he might have actually survived the entire scenario.
Butch Ferguson says,
Good point.
Roars could be heard. SFX, Groar. Butch, Homer and Shane start looking around the area. 25. Homer Graves says,
That must be the rest of the team.
Shane Davidson says,
Yeah. They must be in trouble.
Butch Ferguson says,
We've better go check it out.
Homer Graves says,
Good idea.
Shane Davidson says,
Good idea.
Shane, Homer, and Butch leave the area. Cut to Interior Bridge. Day. Hal, Clint, and Don are on the bridge. Don Delgado says,
Guys, what's going on? Please respond.
Clint George says,
This isn't good.
Hal Harris says,
Yeah.
Don Delgado says,
What should we do?
Hal Harris says,
Try contacting Butch.
Don Delgado says,
Understood.
Don gets on the radio. Don Delgado says,
Butch, are you there?
Butch Ferguson says,
I'm here.
26. Don Delgado says,
What's your status?
Butch Ferguson says,
Homer, Shane, and I are all right. We did hear roars in the area.
Don Delgado says,
That can't be good.
Butch Ferguson says,
Yeah. We were on our way to find the rest of the team.
Don Delgado says,
That's good to hear.
Butch Ferguson says,
By the way, did you get a trace on their location?
Don Delgado says,
I tried. There doesn't seem to be any response from Leland, Cornelius, and Terrence.
Butch Ferguson says,
That can't be good.
Don Delgado says,
Yeah, I'll try to get a trace.
Butch Ferguson says,
Understood?
Don ends the radio transmission. Hal Harris says,
That's good to hear.
Don Delgado says,
Yeah.
27. Clint George says,
That roar doesn't sound good.
Don Delgado says,
That's what I'm thinking.
Hal Harris says,
Of course.
Clint George says,
From the looks of it, the rumors may be true.
Hal Harris says,
Exactly.
Don Delgado says,
What should we do now?
Hal Harris says,
You are to trace the source of the roars.
Don Delgado says,
Understood, sir.
Clint George says,
What about me?
Hal Harris says,
You are to get ready in case we have to bail from this place.
Clint George says,
Bail. From this place. Are you serious?
Hal Harris says,
Yes. From the sounds of it, the rumors are true.
Don Delgado says,
Sir, with all due respect, we can't leave our crewmates there to die.
Hal Harris says,
Believe me, you're not the only one concerned for their safety.
28. Don Delgado says,
We should at least wait until it's absolutely certain that they didn't survive the situation.
Hal Harris says,
Of course.
Don Delgado says,
Understood.
Cut to Interior Lab. Day. Butch, Homer, and Shane are making their way through the lab. Butch is holding the radio. Butch Ferguson says,
Quickly, guys. We have to get to the other teammate's location.
Shane Davidson says,
We're hurrying as fast as possible.
Homer Graves says,
Yeah.
Butch gets on the radio. Butch Ferguson says,
Into radio vertical bar Leland, Cornelius, Terrence. Are you guys there? Please respond.
Static could be heard over the radio. Butch Ferguson says,
Is anyone there? Please respond.
Butch hears something over the radio. Butch Ferguson says,
Oh, thank God. There's someone on the other end of the line. Do you read me?
Cornelius Pittman says,
Is anyone there? Can you read me?
29. Butch Ferguson says,
We hear you loud and clear, Cornelius.
Cornelius Pittman says,
Butch, is that you?
Butch Ferguson says,
Yeah. Where are Leland and Terrence?
Cornelius Pittman says,
Leland's dead. I'm not sure where Terrence is.
Butch Ferguson says,
Leland's dead? Are you sure about that?
Cornelius Pittman says,
Yes, I found his remains. He was killed by some sort of mutant thing.
Butch Ferguson says,
Mutant thing? You might want to know something.
Cornelius Pittman says,
What is it?
Butch Ferguson says,
We recently found a group of videos. One reveals the existence of a mutant that is a hybrid of human and piranha.
Cornelius Pittman says,
That would explain a lot.
30. Butch Ferguson says,
Exactly. Where's your current location?
Cornelius Pittman says,
I'm in the room on the east side of the lab. As for Terrence, I have no idea.
Butch Ferguson says,
That's right. We'll be on our way.
Cornelius Pittman says,
Understood.
Cornelius ends the transmission. Butch Ferguson says,
At least we know that we lost one guy, and another is missing.
Homer Graves says,
Yes, at least we know that one is still alive.
Shane Davidson says,
Yeah. At least for the time being.
Butch Ferguson says,
Yeah. We'd better hurry it up.
Homer Graves says,
Of course.
Butch, Homer, and Shane start hurrying up. Cut to, interior room, day. Terrence Copeland is in the room. Terrence Copeland says,
I can't believe that there is a mutant in the lab. I hope the guys are safe.
Mutant's POV, 31. The mutant was stalking Terrence. Mutant says,
Grar.
Cut to, interior room, day. Butch, Homer, and Shane arrive in the room. They see Cornelius. Butch Ferguson says,
Hey Cornelius.
Cornelius sees the trio. Cornelius Pittman says,
It's about time you showed up.
Butch Ferguson says,
Of course. We got here as fast as we could.
Cornelius Pittman says,
The main thing is that you guys are here.
Butch Ferguson says,
Of course.
Butch thinks of something. Butch Ferguson says,
Where did you find Leland?
Cornelius Pittman says,
Oh yeah, Leland's dead. I saw him over in the corner.
Cornelius points to the corner. Butch, Homer, and Shane see Leland's remains. Homer Graves says,
Oh my God.
Shane Davidson says,
Yeah. Leland's dead.
Homer Graves says,
Yeah, at least there's 5 of us remaining.
32. Shane Davidson says,
That's right.
The 4 members hear a scream. Homer Graves says,
Oh my God, what was that?
Shane Davidson says,
That sounded like Terrence.
Cornelius Pittman says,
You might be right about that.
Cornelius heads towards the door. Cornelius Pittman says,
Well, what are we waiting for? Terrence might be in danger.
Homer Graves says,
He's right. We should do something about the mutant.
Butch Ferguson says,
In that case, we'll go.
The 4 guys leave the room. Exterior lab, day. A boat arrives in the area. Interior boat, day. Tanner Daniel is in the boat. Tanner Daniel says,
So, there's another ship in the area. I have a bad feeling they'll be getting in over their heads.
Tanner sees another dock. He maneuvers the boat to the dock. Exterior dock, day. Tanner moves the boat to the dock. He moors the boat. Tanner Daniel says,
Now, it's time to stop the mutant from getting out.
33. Tanner disembarks from the boat. Cut to, interior lab, day. Butch, Cornelius, Homer, and Shane arrive in the room. They see Terrence. Terrence sees them. Terrence Copeland says,
Thank God you guys are here.
Butch Ferguson says,
At least you're alive.
A faint growling sound could be heard. SFX, growl. Homer Graves says,
My God, what was that?
Terrence Copeland says,
That's the creature.
Cornelius Pittman says,
Creature.
Butch Ferguson says,
Yeah. We mentioned it to you earlier.
Cornelius Pittman says,
That's right. You said something about a mutant.
Homer Graves says,
That's right.
Butch Ferguson says,
We'd better stay together, just in case.
Another growl is heard. SFX, growl. Cornelius Pittman says,
Oh my God. He's getting closer.
Shane Davidson says,
Yeah.
34. Homer Graves says,
I have to agree. Didn't you see what happened on the recording?
Butch Ferguson says,
That may be true. But there is one thing you should know.
Cornelius Pittman says,
What is it?
Butch Ferguson says,
There's 4 of us, and there's only one of him.
Cornelius Pittman says,
I begin to see your point.
Butch Ferguson says,
Of course.
A scream could be heard. It is from Terrence Copeland. Terrence Copeland, OS, says,
AIEE.
Homer Graves says,
Oh my God, that sounded like Terrence.
Shane Davidson says,
Hey, you're right.
Cornelius Pittman says,
That's it. I'm going in.
Cornelius goes towards the door. Butch Ferguson says,
Wait.
Butch approaches Cornelius. He attempts to stop Cornelius. Cornelius runs to the next room. Homer Graves says,
What are we waiting for? We should go after him.
Shane Davidson says,
Yeah.
35. Butch Ferguson says,
Why do I even bother with this?
Homer, Shane, and Butch head towards the other room. Interior room, day. Homer, Shane, and Butch enter the room. They see Cornelius, Terrence, and the mutant. The mutant kills Terrence. Cornelius Pittman says,
Oh my God. He's dead.
Cornelius sees the mutant turn to face him. Cornelius Pittman says,
You monster.
Cornelius rushes towards the mutant. Cornelius Pittman says,
You shall pay for what you done.
Cornelius attempts to tackle the mutant. The mutant swats Cornelius away. Butch rushes over to Cornelius. Butch Ferguson says,
What were you thinking?
Cornelius Pittman says,
Didn't you see what happened?
Butch Ferguson says,
We can't possibly do this secretly.
Cornelius Pittman says.
But we would have to do something.
Butch Ferguson says.
Yes. But we have to attack together on this one.
Cornelius Pittman says.
Understood.
Cornelius gets back up. Cornelius Pittman says.
What should we do?
36. Butch Ferguson says.
Well, there's 4 of us, and 1 of him.
Cornelius Pittman says.
I get it now. You intend to gang up on him.
Butch Ferguson says.
Exactly.
Butch turns to Homer and Shane. Butch Ferguson says.
Homer, Shane.
Homer and Shane approach the pair. Homer Graves says.
What is it?
Shane Davidson says.
Yeah. What's the plan?
Butch Ferguson says.
On my mark, we gang up on the mutant.
Homer Graves says.
I get it now.
Shane Davidson says.
Yeah. You intend to have us gang up on the mutant?
Butch Ferguson says.
Exactly.
Homer Graves says.
I'm not sure if it will work.
Cornelius Pittman says.
When do we start this plan?
Butch Ferguson says.
On the count of 3, we go.
Cornelius Pittman says.
Understood.
Butch Ferguson says.
Are you guys ready?
37. Homer Graves says.
Yes.
Shane Davidson says.
Yes.
Cornelius Pittman says.
Yes.
Butch Ferguson says.
All right. On my mark, we go. 1, 2.
Cornelius Pittman says.
That's it. I'm going in.
Cornelius rushes towards the mutant. Butch Ferguson says.
Cornelius. Wait.
Cornelius manages to tackle the mutant. He starts punching the mutant. Cornelius Pittman says.
This is for what you did to Terrence.
The mutant claws at Cornelius. Cornelius Pittman says.
Awk.
Cornelius falls down. The mutant rises. The mutant grabs Cornelius. The mutant bites Cornelius in his head. Cornelius Pittman says.
Awk.
Cornelius dies from his wounds. Homer Graves says.
Oh my God. Cornelius is dead.
Shane Davidson says.
We have to do something now.
Butch Ferguson says.
All right, we go now?
Homer Graves says.
Understood.
38. Shane Davidson says.
Understood.
Butch, Shane, and Homer all gang up on the mutant. The mutant slashes at Shane. All 3 members pile up on the mutant. The mutant manages to throw the 3 of them off. Butch Ferguson says.
Damn. We almost have him.
Homer Graves says.
Yeah.
The mutant lunges at Shane. The mutant kills Shane. Homer Graves says.
Oh my God. Shane's dead.
Butch Ferguson says.
Yeah. There's only 2 of us left.
Homer Graves says.
What do we do now?
Butch Ferguson says.
I'm not exactly sure.
Homer Graves says.
I can't believe that we managed to lose 4 of our members.
Butch Ferguson says.
Yeah.
The mutant lunges at Homer. Butch Ferguson says.
Homer.
Homer struggles with the mutant. Homer Graves says.
Damn you, mutant. You shall not win.
The mutant manages to overpower Homer. The mutant kills Homer. Butch Ferguson says.
Damn. It's just me who remains.
The mutant turns to face Butch. 39. Butch Ferguson says.
Damn. He sees me.
The mutant slowly marches towards Butch. Butch starts backing up. Butch Ferguson says.
Oh great. I have to think of something, and quick.
Don contacts Butch over the radio. Don Delgado says.
Butch, are you there? Please respond.
Butch Ferguson says.
I'm here. What is it?
Don Delgado says.
What's your status?
Butch Ferguson says.
I have encountered the mutant. All of the other members of the survey team have died. I am the only remaining member who's still alive.
Hal gets on the radio. Hal Harris says.
You encountered the mutant. You're the only one left alive.
Butch Ferguson says.
Yes.
Hal Harris says.
Then get out of there, right away.
Butch Ferguson says.
Understood?
Butch ends the transmission. 40. Butch Ferguson says.
Now, there's one more thing to do.
Butch heads towards the door. The mutant proceeds to knock the radio out of his hands. Butch Ferguson says.
Damn.
The mutant stomps on the radio, smashing it in the process. Butch Ferguson says.
Damn.
Butch runs out the area. The mutant follows him. Interior room. Afternoon. Tanner was making his way into the lab. Tanner Daniel says.
Now, to end this horror, once and for all.
Tanner looks down at the motion sensor. Tanner Daniel says.
So, the mutant is nearby.
He sees another blip on the motion sensor. Tanner Daniel says.
This is unusual.
He sees the blip is getting closer to his position. Tanner Daniel says.
There's 2 blips. This can't be good.
Tanner readies his gun. Tanner Daniel says.
Alright then, whoever you are, show yourself.
Butch runs into the room. Butch sees him. Butch Ferguson says.
Oh my God. Stop.
41. Tanner Daniel says.
Oh thank God. You're human.
Tanner holsters his gun. Tanner Daniel says.
That was close. I thought you were one of the mutants.
Butch Ferguson says.
Who are you?
Tanner Daniel says.
I'm Tanner Daniel. Who are you?
Butch Ferguson says.
I'm Butch Ferguson.
Tanner Daniel says.
Butch Ferguson. That name sounds familiar.
Butch Ferguson says.
Yeah. I'm part of the Happy Harris Deep Sea Salvage team.
Tanner Daniel says.
I recognize that name. My cousin is Herman Richards.
Butch Ferguson says.
I know that guy. He's the chief engineer.
Tanner Daniel says.
Is that what he does?
Butch Ferguson says.
Yes.
Tanner Daniel says.
You and the team must be here to work on gathering the salvage rights.
Butch Ferguson says.
Yes. But there's one problem.
Tanner Daniel says.
One problem. Let me guess. You and the team encountered the mutant.
42. Butch Ferguson says.
Yes. Wait a minute. How did you know that?
Tanner Daniel says.
I was tracking the mutant for quite a while. Not only that, but I used to be the head of the security team.
Butch realizes something. Butch Ferguson says.
Oh my God. You used to work here.
Tanner Daniel says.
Yes.
Butch Ferguson says.
Then you know about the mutant.
Tanner Daniel says.
Yes.
Butch Ferguson says.
What do you intend to do now?
Tanner Daniel says.
I intend to stop the mutant once and for all.
Butch Ferguson says.
That's rather interesting.
Tanner looks around. Tanner Daniel says.
You're the only one remaining, aren't you?
Butch Ferguson says.
Yes. All the rest of the survey team has been killed by the mutant.
Tanner Daniel says.
Then I advise that you get out of here right away.
Butch Ferguson says.
I was in the process of getting out of here. That's when I encountered you.
43. Tanner Daniel says.
That's good to hear.
Tanner looks at the motion sensor. Tanner Daniel says.
Oh great. He's getting closer.
Butch Ferguson says.
Then I've better get out of here.
Tanner Daniel says.
That's definitely a good idea.
Tanner sees the motion sensor. Tanner Daniel says.
You get out of here. I'll handle the mutant.
Butch leaves the room. He steps into the doorway. Tanner sees him. Butch Ferguson says.
How are you going to deal with the mutant?
Tanner Daniel says.
I set this place to blow up.
Butch Ferguson says.
I get it now.
Tanner Daniel says.
Now get out of here, right away.
Butch Ferguson says.
Understood?
Butch leaves the room. Cut to Interior Bridge. Afternoon. Hal, Clint, and Don are on the bridge. Don is getting on the radio. Don Delgado says.
Is anyone there? Please respond.
44. Clint George says.
I have a bad feeling about this.
Hal Harris says.
I have a bad feeling that we may have to leave.
Clint George says.
But, sir, you can't possibly be serious.
Don Delgado says.
With all due respect, sir, we should at least wait a couple of more minutes before we leave.
Hal Harris says.
All right. We'll wait 1 more hour before we leave.
Don Delgado says.
Thank you, sir.
Hal Harris says.
I just hope the guys make it out of there alive.
Cut to Interior Lab. Afternoon. Tanner was looking around the area. Tanner Daniel says.
Now then, where are you?
Tanner looks at the motion sensor. Tanner Daniel says.
There you are, mutant.
Tanner heads to the location of the mutant. Interior testing room. Afternoon. Tanner enters the testing room. He sees the mutant. Tanner Daniel says.
So, we meet at last. After all this time, I will finally complete what I set out to do.
45. The mutant turns to see him. Mutant says.
Raph.
The mutant charges at Tanner. Tanner punches the mutant. The mutant attempts to claw at Tanner. Tanner narrowly avoids the attack. Tanner Daniel says.
That was close.
Tanner comes up with an idea. Tanner Daniel says.
Now all I have to do is to lead him to the generator core.
Tanner starts backing up. He looks over his shoulder. Tanner Daniel says.
There's the door.
Tanner heads towards the door. He approaches the door. He turns around. Tanner Daniel says.
Hey you.
The mutant sees him. Tanner Daniel says.
Catch me, if you can.
Mutant says.
Raph.
The mutant rushes after Tanner. Cut to Exterior Dock. Afternoon. Butch arrives on the dock. He sees the mini-boat. Butch Ferguson says.
Oh great. The mini-boat's damaged.
He sees another radio. 46. Butch Ferguson says.
Well, at least I have a way to contact Hal and the rest of the crew.
Butch grabs the radio. He turns it on. Butch Ferguson says.
Don, are you there? Please respond.
Static could be heard over the radio. Butch Ferguson says.
Please respond.
The signal comes through the radio. Don Delgado says.
Butch, are you there?
Butch Ferguson says.
Thank God. I'm here, Don.
Don Delgado says.
Thank God you're alive. Where are you?
Butch Ferguson says.
I'm on the dock. The mini-boat's damaged.
Don Delgado says.
The good thing is that you're alive.
Butch Ferguson says.
Yes. I'm now waiting for you guys to pick me up.
Don Delgado says.
We'll be there right away.
47. Butch Ferguson says.
Understood?
Butch ends the transmission. Cut to Interior Bridge. Afternoon. Hal, Clint, and Don are on the bridge. Don Delgado says.
I have great news, guys.
Hal Harris says.
What is it?
Clint George says.
Yeah, what are you talking about?
Don Delgado says.
Butch survived.
Hal Harris says.
That's great.
Clint George says.
Yeah, we don't have to abandon any of our crewmates.
Don Delgado says.
Exactly. There's just one problem.
Hal Harris says.
What is it?
Don Delgado says.
The mini-boat's damaged. He won't be able to use it to get back to the Minotaur.
Hal Harris says.
In that case, we shall go get him.
Hal turns to Clint. Hal Harris says.
Clint, set a course for the Advanced Test Center for Genetic Mutations.
48. Clint George says.
Aye, sir.
Clint sets the course for the ship. The ship moves towards the Advanced Test Center for Genetic Mutations. Cut to Exterior Dock. Afternoon. Butch is on the dock. Butch Ferguson says.
Now all I have to do is wait.
Cut to Interior Generator Room. Afternoon. Tanner makes it into the generator room. Tanner Daniel says.
Finally, I'm here.
Tanner hears the mutant. Tanner Daniel says.
So, he's almost here.
Tanner looks around the area. He sees that the main reactor is in the center of the room. He sees that the explosives are in place. Tanner Daniel says.
Good. Everything's in place.
The mutant enters the room. Tanner sees him. Tanner Daniel says.
So, you finally arrived.
Mutant says.
Raph.
The mutant lunges at Tanner. Tanner manages to avoid the attack. Tanner punches the mutant. The mutant stumbles backwards. Tanner Daniel says.
You shall pay for what you did.
49. Tanner takes out his handgun. He aims it at the mutant. Tanner Daniel says.
This is for all the people you killed during your rampage.
Tanner shoots at the mutant. The mutant stumbles backwards. Mutant says.
Raph.
The mutant charges at Tanner. The mutant slashes at Tanner. The mutant bites Tanner in the shoulder. Tanner Daniel says.
Oh.
Tanner grabs his combat knife. He stabs the mutant. The mutant lets go of Tanner. Tanner Daniel says.
It seems you and I are now wounded.
Mutant says.
Grr.
Tanner Daniel says.
It seems you can't speak.
Mutant says.
You would be surprised.
Tanner Daniel says.
What the hell? It seems you can talk after all.
Mutant says.
Yes, the ones who created me used human DNA in my creation.
Tanner Daniel says.
That would explain the humanoid appearance, though that wouldn't explain your ability to talk.
Mutant says.
The ones who created me were surprised as well. They thought I couldn't speak.
Tanner Daniel says.
You must know why I'm here.
50. Mutant says.
Yes, you seek revenge against me.
Tanner Daniel says.
Yes. Let this be our last battle.
Mutant says.
Of course.
The mutant charges at Tanner. Tanner activates the timer on the explosives. Insert. 2 minutes, 30 seconds remain on the timer until detonation. Tanner Daniel says.
You see the bombs.
Mutant says.
Yes.
2 minutes, 10 seconds until detonation. Tanner Daniel says.
It's going to explode, taking this entire place with it.
Mutant says.
Then we go down together.
Tanner Daniel says.
Of course.
1 minute, 50 seconds until detonation. The mutant lunges at Tanner. Tanner narrowly avoids the attack. 1 minute, 45 seconds until detonation. Tanner takes out his gun. He fires several shots at the mutant, severely injuring him in the process. 1 minute, 30 seconds until detonation. Tanner Daniel says.
Only a minute and a half left.
The mutant charges at Tanner. Tanner narrowly avoids the attack. The mutant sees a sharp piece of metal. The mutant grabs it. He charges at Tanner. He starts slashing at Tanner with the piece of metal. 51. 1 minute, 10 seconds until detonation. Tanner uses his combat knife. He blocks the attack. Mutant says.
You will fall.
Tanner Daniel says.
I may fall, but so will you.
50 seconds until detonation. Cut to Exterior Dock. Afternoon. The salvage ship the Minotaur arrives at the dock. Butch sees the gangway being moved into position. Butch Ferguson says,
"Oh, thank God."
The crew member sees Butch. Crew member says,
"Hey Butch."
Butch Ferguson says,
"Hey."
Crew member says,
"Let's get out of here."
Butch Ferguson says,
"Understood."
Butch quickly climbs up the gangway. He rushes into the bridge. 40 seconds until detonation. Cut to interior bridge. Afternoon. Butch enters the bridge. Hal, Clint, and Dawn see him. Hal Harris says,
"Thank God you're alive."
Clint George says,
"Yeah."
52. Butch Ferguson says,
"Of course. Let's get the hell out of here."
Hal Harris says,
"Why is that?"
Butch Ferguson says,
"The place is about to blow up. We don't have much time."
Hal Harris says,
"Understood."
Hal gets on the intercom. Hal Harris says,
"Hey Herman."
Cut to interior engineering room. Afternoon. Herman is in the room. He presses the button. Herman Richards says,
What is it?
Hal Harris says,
"I need you to put the engine into overdrive."
Herman Richards says,
Understood, sir.
Herman pushes the engine into overdrive. Cut to interior bridge. Afternoon. Hal is on the bridge. He ends the transmission. Hal Harris says,
"Clint, set a course for anywhere out of here."
53. Clint George says,
Aye, sir.
Clint sets a course out of the area. 20 seconds until detonation. Hal moves the throttle into full speed. The ship speeds up. The ship moves away from the Advanced Test Center for Genetic Mutations. Cut to interior generator core. Afternoon. Tanner and the mutant are in the generator room. Tanner Daniel says,
"It looks like I'm going to win after all."
Mutant says,
"But you will die in the process."
10 seconds until detonation. Tanner Daniel says,
"Only 10 seconds left."
The mutant sees the explosives. Mutant says,
"What?"
The mutant slashes at Tanner. Tanner is seriously wounded. Tanner Daniel says,
"I will win after all."
5 seconds until detonation. The mutant attempts to escape. 4 seconds until detonation. The mutant runs out of the generator core. 3 seconds until detonation. The mutant enters the hull. 2 seconds until detonation. 54. Mutant says,
"I must make it out of here."
1 second until detonation. Mutant says,
"It looks like I won't make it out of here."
0 seconds until detonation. SFX, kaboom. The explosives detonate, destroying the generator core. It results in a chain reaction. Cut to exterior South Atlantic Ocean. Afternoon. The salvage ship the Minotaur is in the area. It is making its way out of the area. The Advanced Test Center for Genetic Mutations is in the background. A large fireball erupts from the lab as it explodes. Exterior salvage ship. Afternoon. Butch is on the deck of the ship. Butch Ferguson says,
"So, this is all over."
In walks Hal Harris. Hal Harris says,
"So, it looks like you were right."
Butch Ferguson says,
"Yeah. It looks like we won't be paid for our services."
Hal Harris says,
"True, but at least we're still alive."
Butch Ferguson says,
"I guess you're right."
Hal Harris says,
"Of course."
55. Butch Ferguson says,
"What shall we do now?"
Hal Harris says,
"We tell our employer about the situation. Not only that, but we inform the families of the crew members we lost."
Butch Ferguson says,
"Understood, sir."
Butch and Hal head back down to the bridge. They have no idea what will happen next. Fade out. Roll end credits.